Welcome to our podcast, where today we will be talking about Malaka Grant's TED Talk on why language shapes identity more than race. First up, we have Taelyn with the summary of the TED Talk.
In the TED Talk by Malaka Grant, she argues that language shapes identity more profoundly than race. She draws on her experiences as an American immigrant in South Africa and how she observes her new environment. She explains that in her new environment, language determines belonging, social hierarchy, and cultural perception more than skin color. In the TED Talk, Grant claims that in South Africa, being Zulu, Xhosa, or Afrikaans speaking signals one's community, history, and status. She reflects on how language has historically been used as both a tool of oppression through colonization, apartheid, and forced language assimilation, and as a means of empowerment, as seen when marginalized groups reclaim or master new languages for social mobility. Grant's core idea that language determines identity aligns with Boroditsky's published in 2001 research on linguistic relativity, which shows that Mandarin and English speakers conceptualize time differently based on their language's spatial metaphors. Just as Mandarin speakers think of time vertically and English speakers horizontally, Grant suggests that the language we use structures how we perceive ourselves and others. Similarly, Marian's article posted in 2023 emphasizes that language codes shape how we think, remember, and experience emotion. Grant's idea that speaking someone's language of the heart transforms connection, reflecting Marian's findings that language activates different cognitive and emotional systems, influencing how we empathize and form relationships. Additionally, the reading by Pillar, published in 2025, explores how intercultural communication reflects and reproduces power relations. Grant's TED Talk mirrors this by revealing that language hierarchies create systems of privilege and exclusion, particularly in post-colonial contexts like South Africa. Grant's experiences highlight how language becomes a marker of social capital, which resonates with Pillar's argument that language choice signals cultural alignment, authority, and belonging with diverse societies. Grant discussed the colonial language suppression, which parallels Rice's published in 2023 work on Indigenous language revitalization in Canada. They both describe how colonizers imposed dominant languages to erase cultural identity and control population. Grant's reflection on Ghanaian children being punished for speaking native languages echoes Rice's account of residential schools, where Indigenous children were forbidden to speak their mother tongues. Then, they both highlighted how reviving and valuing native languages restores cultural identity and intergenerational continuity. Grant and Marsh, published in 2020, both focus on cognitive control and metacognition, and both their ideas connect metaphorically to language control and cognitive freedom. Just as cognitive control allows individuals to manage competing and mental processes, the ability to navigate multiple linguistic identities requires metacognitive awareness, which is understanding when and how languages shapes thought and social context. Lastly, Pinker, published in 2004, argues that both biological predispositions and environmental factors contribute to human development, and similarly, Grant complements this by positioning language as a nurture-based and deeply ingrained cognitive force. Language acts as an environmental medium through cultural identity, thought, and emotional understanding. This illustrates Pinker's point that human traits emerge from the interaction of innate capacities and linguistic cultural environments. Overall, the TED Talk by Malaka Grant embodies the intersection of linguistic relativity, social identity, and cognitive psychology. Language is shown as a cultural technology, a cognitive frame, a social divider, a connector, and a psychological control system. Ultimately, both the TED Talk and the readings converge on the idea that language is not merely a tool of communication, it is the architecture of thought, culture, and human connection.
Next, we have Parisa explaining two major key points and themes in the TED Talk.
One of the major key themes Malaka Grant highlights in her TED Talk is the idea of using language to identify and determine belonging. She argues that language can be a powerful tool for inclusion and exclusion, especially in South Africa, where language is a key marker of identity. Language can position someone as an insider or outsider even more quickly than prejudices and biases with race. To articulate this point, Grant cites the feminist writer Rita Mae Brown, who says, "Language is the roadmap of culture. It tells you where its people come from and where they are going." Grant uses this quote to show that language is a part of one's identity, belonging, and values. Around the 6-minute mark of her talk, Grant emphasizes that language in itself is neutral, as it is not naturally oppressive, kind, uplifting, or violent. Instead, language is a powerful tool that can be used by people to uplift, but also oppress and be violent with. Throughout her experiences in South Africa, Grant noticed that language becomes the primary way people categorize one another, which differs from how people are identified in Canada or the US. For example, being Zulu-speaking or Afrikaans-speaking signaled one's history, community, and place in the social hierarchy. This idea of hierarchy leads to the second part of the theme of language as a marker of belonging. Towards the end of her talk, Grant explains that language hierarchies exist all around us and are put in place to rank the human race from most valuable to the least. These hierarchies play a huge role in one's belonging because they determine who is taken seriously, who gets certain opportunities, and who is marginalized in a given society. One point that stuck out to me was when she explained that one of the first strategies of any colonial force is to destroy the native languages of a community. She references how colonial governments have historically tried to destroy indigenous languages as a method of destroying culture. This connects with what we have seen in a Canadian context with policies like the Indian Act, which is still in effect today. During a lecture about the history of Indigenous settler relationships in weeks 6 and 7, we learned that even though the Indian Act has been amended over time to return certain rights to First Nations communities, many discriminatory practices have continued for decades. For example, women losing their Indigenous status if married to a non-First Nations man. This shows the deep colonial structures embedded in Canada. Specifically, as seen in the same lecture, residential schools, established in 1883, were mandatory for Indigenous children and emerged as part of Canada's assimilation policies. This lecture shows that residential schools stripped Indigenous children of their language and culture, forcing them to be, quote, civilized and to lose all, quote, barbaric mannerisms from home. Grant continues this discussion by saying that if language is the roadmap of culture and these children were stripped of their native language, whose roadmap will they use? Without access to their mother tongues, people are forced to navigate the world using someone else's roadmap, or as referred to in class, worldview, which does not reflect their personal history, identity, or sense of belonging. This is where Grant makes her key point that losing language is not only losing words, but losing a connection to self, community, and cultural identity. In her TED Talk, she explains that this loss of culture creates long-term consequences for how individuals understand who they are and where they fit within language hierarchies. When a dominant group imposes its language on others, it also imposes its worldview and way of being. As a result, entire generations may grow up with a fractured sense of identity, leaving people feel disconnected from their culture. This theme is also closely related to the discussion of education in the second lecture for week 8, as we have learned that when curricula only reflects Eurocentric ideas, kids of different cultures do not see themselves represented, making them internalize ideas that their way of being is wrong.
Next, we have Rayan explaining another major key point.
Another major key point that really stood out to us from Anika Grant's TED Talk is internalized language shame and how people begin to believe that the way they naturally speak is somehow less intelligent or wrong. I found this very interestingly connected to several ideas we learned in class from Unit 1 and 2. In Unit 1, we learned about the impact of language on thought and identity. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the Boroditsky reading argue that language does not just describe who we are. it shapes our worldview and also shapes how people perceive us. Malaka's experience showed the social side of this. She was not only switching accents, she was switching between identities because each accent carries different expectations and stereotypes. The shame she felt about her natural accent is an example of how language influences self concept. This connects directly to psycholinguistics, where language influences not only how we think, but how we think about ourselves and how other people perceive us as well. Something else that stuck with me is intercultural communication, especially what we learned from Pillar, talking about how language acts as a marker of belonging. And Pillar explains that people use language to categorize others into in group and out group. Once these categories are created, people start adjusting their behaviors to fit in. Malaka described this in her TED Talk, saying she felt pressure to modify her voice so she could be taken seriously, respected more, or not judged. This pressure does not come out of nowhere. It comes from the linguistic norms and power structures that exist and are embedded in society. This is also where internalized bias comes in. In class, we talked about how language bias is not just external. People eventually start believing the stereotypes attached to their own language. Malaka's story shows this clearly as she did not just notice the judgments from others, she started absorbing them. She started to question her own voice, home accent, and her linguistic identity because she saw how society ranked certain ways of speaking as educated or proper. This connects to what we learned in class about linguistic inequality in Unit 2, how language and dialects get placed into hierarchies and make some people sound prestigious and others sound inferior. Internalized language shame is basically the psychological result of these hierarchies. When you live in a system that treats a certain language or accent as superior, you start to feel like you need to fix yourself to match it. Pillar talks about this indirectly when she explained how migrants adjust their language to avoid negative stereotypes. And Malak is giving us real-life emotional version of that theory. She shows the internal conflict of wanting to sound like yourself, but also wanting to be accepted. Another connection to the course that really stood out was the idea that language carries culture, which we discussed during week 5. When people feel ashamed of their accent, they're just not changing the pronunciation. They're distancing themselves from a part of their culture and their home. Malek explains that reclaiming her own voice to help her rebuild a healthier identity. That's similar to what we learned about heritage language and cultural identity. When people re-embrace their original way of speaking, it becomes a form of resistance and self-acceptance. Overall, everything Malaka talks about really connects back to the main themes of our course, and she shows how language isn't just a tool for communication, but it shapes identity, and it influences how we see ourselves and even affects how much we feel like we belong. The internalized shame she describes, the pressure to change your accent, the way people judge you based on how you speak, all of this ties directly to what we learn about culture, language, and power in Units 1 and 2. Her story basically brings our whole course to life. Instead of just reading about these linguistic relatively or intercultural communication, she gives us like a real example of what these theories look like in someone's everyday experience. And it's something that a lot of people relate to as well. I think this is what makes her TED Talk so impactful because it takes these academic ideas that we learned about and we've been studying and shows how deeply they affect actual people in their everyday life, their confidence, and their identity, as well as their place in the world.
Next, we have Anika reflecting on key points in critical thinking.
Building on the points mentioned earlier, I kept thinking about how Malaka Grant shows that language does not simply express who we are, it also shapes how we experience the world. This reminds me of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis from the class, which argues that the structure of a language influences how its speaker perceives and categorizes reality. Speaking more than one language can broaden this perceptual pathway because each language highlights different way of understanding and feeling. Grant's talk helped me see that this enrichment is not cognitive, it's emotional and social, and it depends heavily on the hierarchy attached to different language. One of the moments in the talk that stayed with me was Grant's discussion of internalized language hierarchy. When she describes switching her accent depending on the context and the feeling self-conscious about her natural voice, I immediately recognize parts of my own experience. I communicate very comfortably in English online where I have time to think, but in person I often become more cautious. I change my tone, soften certain sounds, or choose simple vocabulary to avoid standing out. If someone asks me to say it again, I sometimes feel embarrassed, even though no one has ever told me that my accent is wrong. Grant's talk helped me name this feeling. It's not about my actual ability in English. It's about the subtle social value attached to certain ways of speaking, which can gradually shape the way we judge ourselves. Once I made this connection, I began to reflect more critically on my own bilingual identity. Over time, English has become what I think as my action language. It's a language I used to function in Canada, studying, sending emails, speaking to professors, and solving problems all happened in English. When I switch into English, my communication become more structured. It feels like a tool I use to manage the external world. Because of this, I rarely turn to English when I need to express my feelings. I do not naturally use English to talk about like child memories or complex emotions. Those feelings simply do not live in English for me. Mandarin works very differently. Mandarin is my emotion language, the language where my memories and feelings come from. When I speak Mandarin, I feel more complete. I can express subtle emotions more naturally and my personality feels fuller. When I'm alone, I always switch to Mandarin in my thoughts. Grant's explanation of how language influences identity helped me see why this divide in myself feels so real. Reflecting on my classmates' point about belongings and linguistic shame also pushed me to think further. Their analysis focus on how society categorizes speakers based on the language. My reflection is about how we categorize ourselves. Grant's talk made me think about a deeper question. What does belonging mean if the language we use every day for survival is not the language that carries our emotional truth?
Next, we have reflection questions and conclusion. Before I get into my reflection questions, I want to mention that listening to Malaka Grant's TED Talk really made me think about how personal language actually is. We usually treat language like it's just grammar or vocabulary, but Grant shows that it's so much deeper. It shapes how we see ourselves, how others see us, and even where we feel like we belong. Everything the group talked about, from language hierarchies to accent shifting to colonial language loss, all goes back to this bigger idea that language and identity are completely connected. So, for my part, I wanted to ask a couple of reflection questions that get us to think about our own experiences, and also the experiences of communities whose languages have been judged or taken away. With that in mind, here are the two questions I came up with. Have you ever changed the way you speak, your accent, vocabulary, or tone just to fit in or feel taken seriously? What did that moment teach you about how language shapes identity? In the TED Talk, Grant talks a lot about how language can make you feel like you belong or make you feel like an outsider, even faster than race sometimes. And honestly, that part really stuck with me. Most of us have had at least one moment where we've changed our voice a bit, maybe speaking more proper, avoiding slang, or hiding an accent. When she mentioned feeling embarrassed about her real voice, it reminded me of what we learned in class about how languages and accents get ranked. Some sound smart, some sound less serious, and eventually people start believing those stereotypes about themselves. This question gets us to think about our own lives. Have we ever felt nervous about sounding different? Who were we trying to impress or blend in with? What does that say about the language rules in our everyday world? It connects to the class discussions about how language can create in groups and out groups, and how people sometimes naturally change themselves to be accepted. Grant makes it clear that this isn't just about grammar, it's about identity and self-worth. My second reflection question is, what do you think happens to a community when their language is taken away? And what does it mean when people start bringing that language back? Grant talks about how one of the first colonial forces do is try to erase a group's language. And that hit me because we talked about the exact same thing in class when learning about Indigenous languages in Canada. In residential schools, kids weren't allowed to speak their languages at all. They were punished for it. So when Grant asked if language is the roadmap of culture, what happens when the roadmap is taken away, it really connects. Without your language, you lose traditions, stories, humor, and even ways of thinking. This question pushes us to think about the impact. What does it do to a family when kids can't speak the same language as their grandparents? What does it do to someone's sense of identity when the words they grew up with are labeled as wrong or not useful? And on the flip side, what does it mean when communities bring their language back? We've seen examples in Canada where Indigenous communities fight to revive their languages through schools, programs, and culture camps. That process isn't just about words, it's about healing, reconnecting, and resisting the old systems that try to erase them. Grant's talk makes it clear that celebrating and reclaiming language is a way of rebuilding identity and belonging. To wrap everything up, Malaka Grant's talk really shows us something simple but powerful. Language isn't just how we communicate, it's how we understand who we are, where we belong, and how we're seen in the world. Throughout this episode, we looked about how language can be used to include people, but also how it can push people out. We talked about the way language shapes identity, how accents and tones can carry hidden judgments, and how people sometimes end up changing their voice just to feel accepted. We also connected Grant's ideas to what we learned in class, especially the way colonial systems try to erase certain languages, and how reclaiming those languages becomes a form of healing and resistance. What Grant reminds us is that language holds history, emotion, culture, and connection. It can create distance, but it can also build bridges when we actually listen to one another. So as we end this episode, we want to leave you with the reminder that the way someone speaks is never wrong. It's a reflection of their story. And the more we pay attention to the languages and voices around us, the more we understand the people behind them. Thanks for listening to our conversation, and we hope it made you think about your own relationship with language and identity.